Benzaguru Pema CD Hong Ngo Nga Hong Benzaguru Pema CD Hong Ngo Nga Hong Benzaguru Pema CD Hong. Hello everyone, welcome to my Sunday Dharma talk on Sunday, March 22 in Second Life at 2 p.m. I'm glad to see everyone here. We have a good crowd today, and that's good because we're going to be talking about, according to Nanamoli and Bodhi, the most important sutta in the Pali Canon, and according to Walsh, one of the most important suttas in the Pali Canon, and that is the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So, let me just give you my personal information for those of you who might be new. There you go, I won't bore you with all of that. Feel free to ask me any questions during the course of the talk. I prefer that rather than you holding your questions till the end. And this is a fulsome talk today. It's going to take about 1 hour. So please, if you have any questions about anything in the course of it, feel free to ask. So today we are discussing the 22nd sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, and we're going to begin with theory. And I also hope most of you have read this sutta because it is somewhat complex. This week's talk is widely regarded as one of the most important suttas in the Pali Canon, if not the most important. It appears again in nearly identical language in the Majjhima Nikaya as the Satipatthana Sutta. Since the sutta is so important, I'd like to start by taking the time to analyze the title, which happens to include the central concept of the sutta, which is, of course, Satipatthana. The Pali English Dictionary defines Satipatthana as intent, contemplation, and mindfulness, earnest thought, application of mindfulness. Mahasatipatthana breaks down into Maha plus Sati plus Patthana. And I'm going to explain it, but just so you can also see as I'm explaining it, I'll put it in the chat. So there's the etymology of it. Maha, of course, means great. We're pretty much all familiar with that. Mahatma. Sati, which is the most important word here, has a variety of meanings. It means memory, mindfulness, recollection, active state of mind, fixing the mind strongly on any subject, attention, attentiveness, thought, reflection, and consciousness. And patthana, patthana, means setting forth, putting forward a starting point, and a very almost identical word, patthana, aiming at, means aiming at aspiration or desire. And the two words differ. The T in one case is dotted, the other is not. The A is long and the other is short, but obviously the two words are clearly related. The Sanskrit equivalent is smritu plus pasthana. Smritu means memory, awareness, remembering, remembrance, reminiscence, thinking of or upon, memory, calling to mind or mindfulness, and pasthana means leading or guiding cattle, formed, modeled, or wrought. My proposed title for the sutta, therefore, is The Manual of Cultivating the Great Attention, based on sutta, discourse, plus patthana or patthana, a setting forth or a putting forward, combined with aiming at the starting point or beginning of what is clearly a system of practice, thus a manual for cultivating awareness that aims at or aspires to the starting point or goal by means of the practice of attention or attentiveness. The word attention, rather, can also be readily pluralized, that is the four attentions. To my mind, this title incorporates all of the meanings summarized above in the broadest yet most succinct and accurate way. The sutta has the appearance of an early comprehensive guide to meditation for practitioners, including theory and practice that works through a series of graduated insights that cultivates the dual practice of meditation and wisdom in order to achieve final emancipation. The Buddha is staying in a market town of the Kurus called Kamasadama. This is the same place as in the Mahanidana Sutta, the great discourse on origination, which is the 15th in the Digha Nikaya, and which we've covered in a previous talk. Kuru was the name of an ancient Vedic tribal union, as you may recall, in the northwest region of the Mahajanapadas, the 16 great republics. They became the first known South Asian state, about 1000 before the Common Era. There, the Vedic hymns were arranged in collections, developing the orthodox rituals of Brahmanism. The legends and traditions of the Mahabharata are based on the Kurus. Its culture and politics dominated the Middle Vedic period, but about the year 850 before the Common Era, its influence began to wane, and by the Buddha's time it had become something of a backwater. Nonetheless, it's significant that two major doctrines of the Buddha Dharma, dependent origination, or paticca samuppada, and mindfulness, or sati, were taught here. Bhikkhu Nanamoli remarks that Kamasadama may have been near modern Delhi. Unlike most other suttas, the Buddha is not represented as conversing with a visitor, but rather delivering a sermon directly to the monastics. The Sutta simply records his sermon. No other Sutta in the Digha Nikaya is like this, except for the 26th Sutta, which we'll be discussing in another 4 weeks or so, which presents the Buddha's famous advice to the monastics to be islands and refuges unto themselves, with no other refuge than the Dharma, affirming that the path to emancipation, like emancipation itself, is individual. Interestingly, the Buddha says in the 26th Sutta that the way to do this is by cultivating the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The Buddha declares the ekayano maggo that leads to the purification of being from angst, the woe of existence, dukkha in Pali, angst, ennui, suffering, whichever term you prefer. I'm coming more and more to use the word angst to express the precise nuance of the word dukkha. This was, of course, the Buddha's original purpose when he abandoned the life of the world at the age of 29, and this phrase is a compound of eka plus yano plus maggo. And again, I'll put the etymology in the chat while I discuss it, so you can actually see it laid out. Eka means same, certain, unknown. It's also used for the indefinite article, and it also means one. Yana or yano means carriage, vehicle, or going, and maggo means trace, track, road, path, course, or passage. This fascinating phrase has been variously translated as this one way, the only way, the one and only way, one going, and a path that goes one way only. And compare the phrases direct path or right path. Star Trek fans may note with interest that the Pali word naya, here translated as the right path, can also be translated as logic. It has long been my contention that Mr. Spock, who I'm sure you're all aware died recently, was a Buddhist and a Vulcan was Tibet. This singular way consists of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, so-called. The Pali word is Satipatthana, which we have discussed above. The word foundation is an interesting interpretation, but lacks the directed aspect of the Pali that surely characterizes the certain going, the setting forth, the putting forward, the starting point. I have therefore preferred to refer to the 4 attentions, or consciousness vectors, rather than to the 4 foundations of mindfulness. These consist of directing attention to the body, the feelings, the mind, and mind objects. Body, feelings, mind, and mind objects seem to be associated purposely in a kind of sequence that leads from the most outward level of experience, including our intuition of embodiment, to feelings, sentient mind itself, and finally the mental corollary and polarity of body, Mind objects referring to such things as numbers, logic, the Jungian archetypes, UFOs perhaps, patterns of experience, meanings, etc., that are definitely real but intrinsically non-physical, although they may influence the physical through a kind of feedback loop. Jung called these four qualities the four functions, and the totality that they embody the psyche. Thus, body corresponds to Jung's concept of sensation, feelings precisely to his concept of feelings, of pleasure, pain, and moral and aesthetic judgments. Mind is thinking, and mind objects are intuitions in Jung's classification, the fourfold classification of the psyche. These intuitions, of course, being immediate mental apprehensions that, like sensation, are simply given. There is also a somewhat forced correlation of the four attentions with the five aggregates of form, feeling, consciousness, perception, and mental formations, so-called. And I've only got four there. Feeling, consciousness, perception, mental formation. Consciousness I'm missing. Feeling, oh no, I've got consciousness. Okay, I'm going to have to check my list. I'm missing one there anyway. The five aggregates including feeling, consciousness, perception, mental formations. And one other that I'm missing. The Sutta is a meditation manual. One might even liken it to a nyandro. It lists and describes. Oh, I see a question. Jospe asks, I feel intuition would be direct knowledge. Mind objects are blocking intuition or direct knowledge, right? I would say intuitions are direct knowledge. Direct knowledge is the immediate arising of apprehension, which is what intuitions are. Of course, direct knowledge in the ultimate sense of gnosis or realization of emancipation, in that sense, yes, they are obstacles. So again, it depends on how you use the words. They can mean different things in different contexts, especially in English, which has a far less rich psychological vocabulary than Pali. I would say Jung's intuition is the sense which perceives mind objects. We're going to be discussing the threefold nature of senses later in this talk. But intuition is the faculty or organ, if you like, of the psyche that perceives the non-physical aspect of experience in the same kind of immediate non-rational way, which is the term Jung used, non-rational or irrational, as sensation. We don't we don't produce our sensations, we simply experience them, and they're simply given. Intuitions are the same, and the objects that correspond to the faculty of intuition are the mind objects. There is also a somewhat forced correlation of the four attentions with the five aggregates. Okay, I did that already. Blah, 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 blah. So, the core message of the Sutta. Actually, let me just back up one. The Sutta is a meditation manual. One might even liken it to a nyandro, for those of you who are familiar with the Tibetan system. I've discussed nyandro in the past as well. I've given a talk on nyandro for those who have attended it. It lists and describes no less than 21 different specific meditations organized according to the four attentions, body, feelings, mind, and mind objects in what appears to represent an intentional progression towards a goal. The core message of the Sutta, however, appears in a recurring insight, as Walsh, Nenamoli, and Bodhi all call it. I don't think those titles that they've used to divide the text up are in the original. They put them in square brackets. However, they call it an insight, and it's repeated at the end of each meditation as a kind of refrain. So I'm going to quote that, and I will put it in the chat as well. So this is the refrain that recurs throughout the Sutta. So he abides contemplating body as body internally, contemplating body as body externally, contemplating body and body both internally and externally. So that's the first exercise. Note the progression from subjective to objective, presenting a dichotomy and then the resolution of the dichotomy in a unity, which is, of course, the transdual. He abides contemplating arising phenomena, abides contemplating vanishing phenomena in the body. He abides contemplating both arising and vanishing phenomena in the body. So that's the second exercise, and again, same structure, presents two polarities of a duality, and then they're reconciled in a unity. And then finally, or else mindfulness that there is body is present to him just to the extent necessary for knowledge and awareness. And he abides, independent, not clinging to anything in the world. And that, monks, is how a monk abides, contemplating body as body, or which substitute whichever faculty you wish, because the insight recurs, replacing body with feeling or mind objects, whatever it happens to be. So you can see here this progression from the includes the subjective and objective polarity, and then their reconciliation, the arising and vanishing polarity, and then their reconciliation, and finally simply the quality of mindfulness in itself. Mindfulness to the minimum extent necessary, devoid of content, the simple apprehension of the faculty. This text is repeated 9 times throughout the Sutta, thus dividing the practices up into the following divisions. And I'll put those in the chat as well because they're easier to see the division into 9. First, there's the breathing, which holds the preeminent place. Then there's the group of exercises called the 4 postures, clear awareness, reflection on the body, 4 elements, and the 9 charnel ground contemplations. So those 2 together make up the body. Then the practice mindfulness of the feelings, which only has just 1 practice. Then mindfulness of the mind, again, just one practice. And then the last 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 hindrances, 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and finally the 4 noble truths, which are 5 practices or exercises which all relate to the faculty of mind objects. So 1 and 2, the first 2 pertain to the body, 3 pertains to feelings, 4 pertains to mind, and 5, the 5th through 9th, refer to mind objects. So you can see this is a kind of vipassana. This is a kind of meditation which incorporates the initial stage of just the meditation on the body, tranquility, what is called samatha normally, and then it develops into a series of meditations that are designed to yield some sort of insight or truth. As one can see from the description, the starting point is the grossest level, the body, of what is immediately apprehensible, the internal, or subjective. As I have mentioned in previous talks, making this the basis of meditation is, apparently, an innovation of the Buddha Dharma, as pointed out by Buddhaghosa in the 5th century CE, I believe. As one becomes established in one's meditation at each level, one progresses from the internal to the external, thence to both internal and external in a sort of dialectic by which one realizes the underlying unity in duality. In the second exercise, one converts the intuition of embodiment to the processes that constitute its content, contemplating phenomena as processes in their appearance and disappearance, and finally in both as complementary poles or polarities of a single process. Finally, one realizes the same meditation as the direct apprehension of body without any additional thought or consideration, that is, without content. In this state, one experiences dispassion. The same methodology is applied to the body, feelings, mind, and mind objects through a series of 21 practices. This is an example of the graduated path by which one cultivates the qualities of enlightenment individually in the same manner in which one might build a house, and which is very common in the Tibetan system. The final exercise in this path is the fourth jhana, which is a state of mindful equanimity characterized by indifference toward feelings of pleasure, pain, gladness, sadness, and all similar emotional dichotomies. This state is identified with dispassion and emancipation itself. Thus, the sequence of tasks lays bare the whole structure of the Buddhist path as understood by the anonymous redactors of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. Okay, that completes the first part of the talk on theory, and I have consumed my entire glass of water, so I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions about anything that I have just described. Please put them in the chat now while I go get refill my glass of water. Give me 30 seconds, and then we'll go on to the next part if no one has any questions about this first section on the theory of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So I'll be right back, 30 seconds. There, I have my glass of water. Let me just see if anyone has asked anything. Okay, I see no questions, so thank you. So let's carry on with the second part of the talk, which I'm calling praxis. Starting with 1, mindfulness of the breathing, the first exercise. So in this section, we're going to be going through the exercises one by one, discussing them, pointing out interesting things about them. And the first exercise is, as I mentioned, mindfulness of the breathing. The first group of practices is called contemplation of the body, and the first exercise in this group is called mindfulness of breathing. This exercise is frequently mentioned in the Pali Canon and has a big reputation. The Buddha referred to it as the Tathagata's dwelling, and practiced it himself even after his enlightenment experience. The Buddha said that the practice of mindfulness of the breathing is sufficient by itself to carry the aspirant all the way to emancipation, which raises the question of why the Buddha taught 84,000 meditative techniques. That's the traditional symbolic number, basically a lot, including the 21 highlighted in the Sutta. The traditional answer is that different techniques are suited to different types of people, based on their personal needs and where they are in the path, that is to say, on their karma. For example, not all techniques lead to the highest goal. Thus, metta meditation only leads to rebirth in the Brahma realm. However, the fact that one technique alone is sufficient for enlightenment qualifies our understanding of the gradual path, which includes the notion that a sequence of yogas must be mastered before advanced practice can even begin. For example, the Tibetan approach. Very organizationalist, very hierarchical, and all sorts of elaborate preparations and conditions must be completed before one can actually begin the practice proper in the Tibetan system often. While such a hierarchical structure may have value for some people, it is going too far to say that it is mandatory. At best, one might say that progressive practices are valuable and effective for some people, particularly people who have particular needs, particular issues, karmic issues, or psychological issues that need to be addressed in order to prepare them for practice. Others may pursue a single essential practice with equal efficacy, and of course we also find traditions like that as well. So unless we're willing to say that only our tradition is true, or only our tradition creates enlightened masters, it's difficult to maintain that the graduated path to insist on it dogmatically is a difficult position to defend. The first step and the first practice is to enter into a state of seclusion, whether in the forest, at the foot of a tree, or in an empty place. Second, one sits down cross-legged in the archetypal yoga posture that goes back to Indus Valley civilization, 2600 to 1900, before the Common Era. The famous image of the yogi sitting in cross-legged meditation has a name, Pashupati, I think is the name of it, from the Indus Valley civilization, very famous seal. One holds the body erect and establishes mindfulness before him, quote unquote. Walsh suggests that this means focusing the attention on the breath, long associated with the vital principle of life, energy, and creativity in many primordial traditions, for example, the Sanskrit prana. Thus, quote, mindfully he breathes in, mindfully he breathes out, quote unquote. Without restraining or interfering with the breathing in any way, he observes the length of the breaths as he breathes in and out, whether long or short. To this awareness, he adds awareness of the whole body, calming the whole bodily process, and this is the practice of the mindfulness of the breathing. The second practice is called the Four Postures, and the second exercise applies the principle of mindfulness of the body to the activities of walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. This may be the origin of the famous walking meditation. There's other references as well to walking in the Pali Canon. And the third exercise is called clear awareness. The third exercise, clear awareness, extends this principle of mindfulness to going or looking forward or back, bending, stretching, carrying objects, eating, drinking, chewing, savoring, defecating, urinating, walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, speaking, and staying silent. Clear awareness appears to be a development of the four postures, both in terms of range of activities and in terms of intensity. For example, Walsh uses the word no in the four postures, whereas in the clear awareness exercise he uses the phrase clearly aware of what he is doing, quote unquote. The Pali is sampajana karihoti. And of course that phrase, clear awareness, has all sorts of resonances for the Mahayana as well, strongly suggesting Bodhi or the Buddha nature or concepts of that order. The fourth exercise is called the reflection on the parts of the body. In Walsh's translation, again, these are his titles, I believe, but he calls it reflection on the repulsiveness of the parts of the body. The reflection on the parts of the body consists of an incisive and exacting self-analysis. In other suttas, the cultivation of revulsion towards the body is recommended. It may, however, be argued that revulsion or repulsion is simply another form of attachment, active dislike as distinct from indifference, in which case this exercise should be regarded as compensatory and intermediary rather than cultivating a final goal or state. In other words, it's designed to negate our craving and revulsion together equal indifference, which is the actual goal. That would be my suggestion, since the being in a permanent state of revulsion towards the body does not fit in with my idea, having as I've read through the whole of the Pali Canon. It simply doesn't fit in with my perception of what the Buddha is teaching. However, as an exercise designed for the purpose of cultivating indifference, that would be my interpretation of what the actual function of this exercise is. The fifth exercise, the four elements. This exercise continues the foregoing by analyzing the body in terms of its elemental states: extension, cohesion, temperature, motion, or distension, corresponding to earth, water, fire, and air. These are the translators that are both Walsh and also in the Majjhima Nikaya, Nanamoli and Bhikkhu Bodhi, who are making these equations between extension, cohesion, temperature, and motion or distension, and the four elements. whether that is traditional Buddhist view or a later commentarial view or the translator's view, I'm not sure. Of course, it is an ancient characteristic of primordial wisdom philosophies, this classification of reality in terms of the four elements: earth, fire, water, air. We find it everywhere, including in the Chinese system. Slightly different variation, but still obviously the same fundamental analysis. A more intuitive interpretation might be to regard the body as consisting of solids, liquids, heat, and breath. Finally, my personal favorite, exercise number 6, the 9 charnel ground contemplations. Finally, in the context of the contemplations of the body, the 9 charnel ground contemplations refer to the progressive contemplation of corpses in varying states of decay, ranging from a few days dead to the bones rotted away to powder, and all the intermediate states of decay that one can imagine. This was an exercise that was actually practiced in actual charnel grounds. The Buddha was not unfamiliar with charnel grounds from his days as an ascetic, and the early monks also obtained their robes and sometimes their food from charnel grounds. So this is not a Buddhist innovation by any means. In contemplating the corpses in these states, one reflects on and realizes the fact that there is no essential difference between one's own body and fate and the bodies and fates that one observes. The presumed goal of this practice is the development, of revulsion towards the body, culminating in indifference and detachment from the body. The 7th exercise, Contemplation of Feelings. The second contemplation is directed towards the feelings in the exact Jungian sense of sensations of pleasure, pain, or neutral. Sensations in quotes. Here he simply identifies continuously a feeling as being pleasurable, painful, or neutral, and as sensual or non-sensual. And there is only one exercise for the faculty of feelings. Again, the next one, 8, Contemplation of Mind. This practice is very similar to the previous one on feelings, except that here one cultivates awareness of mental states, including lust, hatred, including therefore what we would call emotions apparently. Emotions are actually not equated with feelings, but rather higher, more complex psychological process. Delusion, contraction, distraction, developed, surpassed, concentrated, and liberated, or their opposites. And I'm not going to go into detail about what each of these things mean. The essential idea is simply to be aware of one's mental states as they arise. Arise, develop, and disappear. The sequence of states does seem to be progressive. The 9th exercise, Contemplation of Mind Objects, which generated some discussion earlier. As I've mentioned in previous talks, Buddhism considers the mind to be a sense, exactly as the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body are. So in the Buddhist worldview, there are not 5, there are 6 senses. Each sense has its correlative objects, which are all equally real. And when I say real in this context, I'm using the word in the conventional sense, accepting that the mind is a 6th sense rather than merely an epiphenomenon of the other 5. The mind must also have its correlative objects, which are as real as what we call matter is. And if you want to read a lot about this in context of modern philosophy, you can read a book called Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead, the famous mathematician, who goes into this at great length and develops a metaphysics based on exactly this idea. And these are the dhammas, the phenomena, referring to phenomena as they are. What the translators are translating, both Nanamoli and Bodhi and Walsh, they all are unanimous in translating dhammas as mind objects. These are the phenomena in the metaphysical sense, as they are in actuality as distinct from how they appear. Today we might call this philosophy patternism. Thus, each sense is threefold, consisting of the internal or subjective aspect, which is merely a thought and has no more reality than a mirage, the external or objective aspect, the object itself, as we would say, which is required if we are even to have experience. So the fact that we have experience demonstrates that this description is correct. And finally, the phenomenological moment that joins the two like glue and constitutes experience. In quantum physics, it's called the act of observation. The Buddha prescribes 5 exercises for contemplation of mind objects, and these really constitute a kind of vipassana. The 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 5 internal and the 6 internal and the 6 external sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. So here we have a little catalog of Buddhist doctrines. All of these refer to psychic facts, laws, if you like, that constitute the metaphysical fabric of experience and are the primary object of Dharma, just as physical laws, the laws of nature so-called, constitute the experiential fabric of metaphysics and are the primary object of science. Practicing mindfulness of the hindrances educates one, and now we're going into a description of the exercises, beginning with mindfulness of the hindrances. So this exercise educates one to ignore the emotions of sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, worry and flurry, and doubt that hinder one from attaining emancipation. Ignored, they disappear because they are created by the mind. The meditator cultivates awareness of each hindrance, for example, sensual desire. One discerns whether or not it is present in oneself. One discerns its arising and vanishing and how to abandon attachment to the hindrance that in turn results in its ceasing to come about in the future. In other words, one interrupts the karmic causal sequence by consciously interrupting the flow. The practice of the 5 aggregates similarly cultivates awareness of the arising and vanishing of the aggregates that are the objects of grasping, craving, or desirous attachment. And these are 1, 2, 3, okay, so now I've got the 5th one. These are forms, feelings, perceptions, mental formulations, the Sankhara Khanda, and consciousness. Forms, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. The mental formations are, of course, the factors that underlie karma, including volition. The Pali word is cetana, or intention. I've already explained the threefold character of the senses in Buddhism. The practice of the 6 internal and the 6 external sense bases is simply the cultivation of awareness of this structure, especially the significance of the phenomenological moment in which subjectivity and objectivity are joined. The text refers to 10 fetters that arise in connection with this joining, namely sensuality, resentment, pride, wrong views, doubt, desire for becoming, attachment to rites and rituals, jealousy, avarice, and ignorance. And you'll note the rites, rituals, and beliefs, or dogmas, are in this list, which we have pointed out in previous talks in the context of religious sectarianism. Ditte, wrong views, can also mean dogma. Having identified each fetter as it arises in the space between subjectivity and objectivity, one might almost like to say the bardo, one abandons it. Having abandoned the fetters of the senses, the aggregates of grasping, and the 5 hindrances, the practitioner learns to identify and cultivate the 7 factors of enlightenment through self-observation. Thus he observes the presence, absence, arising, and development of mindfulness, investigation of states, energy, delight, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So these are, the text says, the primary qualities of enlightenment itself. Mindfulness, investigation of states, also explained as scrutiny, energy, delight, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. Energy in Pali is virya, literally manliness, from the same root actually as virile and virtue in English. Virya, virile, virtue. And virtue is, of course, a common translation of Tao in the Tao Te Ching, of Day rather, in Tao Te Ching. The oldest known representation of the cross-legged posture by what appears to be a shaman or a yogi shaman, also exhibits an erect phallus. Similarly, the word jhana can be translated as ecstasy, and the three jhanas are characterized as states of delight, pleasure, or happiness. Nirvana itself is also clearly characterized as an ecstatic state. Virya also refers to right effort, the sixth limb of the Noble Eightfold Path, and the first of the final three limbs that designate the end of the path. Finally, the exercises of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the exercises of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta conclude with the application of the Four Noble Truths to experience. This is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, and this is the cause of the cessation of suffering. The Buddha describes the various kinds of suffering, including birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain and sadness, distress, being attached to the unloved, being separated from the loved, and not getting what one wants. Given so much suffering, it's not surprising that one might not wish to be born ever again, but the text informs us, quote, "This cannot be gained by wishing," unquote. Craving can only be extinguished by dispassion, not by desire directed towards existence or non-existence. This text refutes the widely held but mistaken notion that the Buddha advocated the pursuit of non-existence. Escape becomes possible through the realization of the universal fact of transitoriness. A Pali word is anicca, a consciousness of which has been cultivated by the foregoing practices on mindfulness, of the arising and non-arising of phenomena. Since everything is transitory, the experience of samsaric bondage itself must be transitory. So we're going to go on now to discuss, I see a question, Rollo. I'm curious of the goals of mindfulness practice. Is seeking to develop indifference meant to allow us a better frame of mind for further purposes, or is it an end in itself? Do we want to abandon passion, intensity of thoughts, feelings, or just be free from its distracting effect? Ultimately, of course, one wants to abandon them altogether. They are distortions of the psyche. They have no inherent value, and they lead us to bondage and error. So, your question is: are they meant to allow us to allow us a better frame of mind for other purposes, or is it an end in itself? Well, the end in itself, it is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, but it's virtually identical with the end. And the means to the end, of course, is enlightenment. Enlightenment in the Buddhist system, and the Buddha makes this very clear from time to time, is virtually identified with the state of dispassion. So, really, I'd say it's both. It's not. Some people like the idea of cultivating dispassion so then they can have fun in samsara without getting involved. But of course, you can't have the fun without getting involved. So really, that's a contradiction. The goal of Buddhism, of course, is to transcend samsara altogether, not merely to cultivate a state of indifference so that we can enjoy sensual pleasure. So that's sort of hidden in your question, but I think that's what you're getting at. And if that's what you're getting at, no, that doesn't work in the Buddhist system, because if you exist in a state of perfect bliss, why would you be interested in the paltry pleasures of samsara? See more here. Dar says, it helps to uproot judgments. We will no longer form judgments in the mind when we feel, see, or hear things. It all becomes conceptual, and we no longer like or dislike, and so we develop equanimity, and as a result we have awareness. Sampajanya, which means clear awareness. When we're mindful, we have sampajanya. We have clear awareness. We see things as they are with clear mind, and you'll see the benefit of this. It keeps your mind clear, keeps you focused. Thank you, Dar. Yes, that's all correct. And of course, indifference does have worldly benefits, samsaric benefits. So in that sense, it does, the cultivation of indifference does have benefits in the world as well. So to that extent, it is true. Okay, I'm going to go on now to discuss the origin of craving. The Buddha identifies how the craving that leads to rebirth arises and establishes itself wherever there is anything agreeable and pleasurable, including the senses, sensory consciousness, sensory contact, feeling, perception, volition, craving itself, thinking, and pondering. Including craving in the list of the causes of craving indicates a profound awareness. It's incredibly profound, not pointed out at all by anyone. But it indicates a profound awareness of what today we would call a feedback loop. The peculiar intensification of craving is due to the way in which craving takes itself as its own fuel. The cessation of suffering arises in the abandonment, not repression. Note, abandonment is not repression. It's quite clear when you read the Mahasatipatthana Sutta that nothing is being repressed, that abandonment is based on the cultivation of awareness. So we're not trying to repress anything. We're not trying to push anything out of consciousness. We're simply being aware of it. And this is a very different perspective than, for example, the Judeo-Christian perspective, which is based on the notions of good and evil, and good and evil must be driven out, it must be denied, repressed, destroyed, blah, blah, blah. And of course we see where that leads. So we need to be very clear that in the Buddhist method, there's no repression. It's all based on clarity of awareness. So the cessation of suffering arises in the abandonment, not repression, of craving, resulting in dispassion. The Buddha reviews the list of places where craving establishes itself, the same list we've already given, but this time he relates it to cessation, the opposite of craving. So he has the same concept of reversal that he has in the doctrine of the Paticca Samuppada, the 12, usually 12 links in the chain of conditioned arising, where they go from ignorance to old age, suffering, and death. That's the direction of nature, and then one can reverse that direction, go from old age, suffering, and death to ignorance. That's the path, and there's the same concept of reversal here. Going on to discuss the Noble Eightfold Path, the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of suffering is, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path. I don't think anyone here needs an explanation of the Noble Eightfold Path, consisting of view, thought, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, or the threefold classification consisting of wisdom, morality, and meditation. In this sutta, view is equated with the Four Noble Truths, which we've just discussed. Thought is equated with renunciation. Speech is equated with the fourth precept of Pansil. The 5 precepts of Pansil, I'm sure everyone's familiar with those. Action summarizes the first three precepts, whereas once again, as I have discussed in other talks, we see that the 5th precept, prohibiting alcohol is absent here, as it frequently is in the Pali Canon, and I've talked about that in another talk. The inclusion of livelihood in the Noble Eightfold Path is very interesting, since monastics are forbidden from carrying on a livelihood because of receiving alms. The only possible interpretation of this fact is that the path is accessible to householders, whereas the livelihood of the monastic may be non-livelihood. Since the Buddha says that Nirvana is only present where the Noble Eightfold Path is present, and vice versa, this is an extraordinarily significant fact that has not been mentioned by anyone else so far as I know. Some might argue that the three stages of meditative practice are above livelihood, and therefore restricted to monastics, but the ubiquity of householders attaining emancipation throughout the Pali Canon, something I pointed out in previous talks, argues against this, as does the Buddha's preaching against the closed fist. However, I have mentioned in previous talks how the evidence of the stories of the Pali Canon themselves, taken as a whole without necessarily implying that any of the stories rather is historically factual, is that householders were very involved with the Sangha and were able to aspire in their own right and even attain emancipation, at which time they would conventionally enter the Sangha. Therefore, we really need to get past the notion, prevalent in some sects of religious Buddhism, which assigns a secondary or inferior status to the householders and an exaggerated status to the monastics, many of whom were and are still Puthajjana monastics. And, I can't remember the author's name. Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon is the name of the book. And I've forgotten the name of the author off the top of my head, but he mentions this, he discusses this at great length, that the real distinction in pre-sectarian Buddhism is between the Aryan and the Aryan and the Puthajjana, not between the monastic and the householder, which is a later reinterpretation of the distinction. And there are Buddhist schools that don't denigrate householders, and there are schools that include Peter Macefield, correct, yes, thank you, Momoko. And there are also schools that have householder paths. The Tibetans are known for this. They have even have a path of householder ordination. This view of householders may be compared to the view of women, another group that is virtually excluded by certain Buddhist groups, but not by the Buddha himself. Right effort is Vayama in Pali. The mental factor behind which is Virya, which we have already encountered as the third of the 7 factors of enlightenment, generally translated as energy. Right effort refers to striving and will. Right mindfulness is identified with the 4 attentions that we have discussed: body, feeling, mind, and mind objects, or dhammas. Finally, right concentration is identified with the 4 jhanas, the process of the progressive refinement of consciousness that we have also discussed in past talks. The first jhana, just to give a very brief recap, the first jhana is produced by the cultivation of detachment. The second jhana is produced by the cultivation of concentration. The third jhana comes about because of the fading away of delight. And the fourth jhana is brought about by the abandonment of pleasure and pain, the 2 characteristics of feeling. Thus, by abandoning feeling, one attains right concentration and the cessation of suffering. Here we see the incredible cohesion of early Buddhist thinking. The Buddha Dharma is not merely a haphazard collection of lists. Rather, it is a profoundly coherent philosophy that implies an original philosopher, the Buddha, which was then carried forward by his immediate disciples, much as Plato carried forward the ideas of Socrates. Okay, that completes the second part of the talk on praxis. Does anyone, and there is a third part, so we're not quite finished. So at this point, does anyone have any questions about either theory or praxis before we go on to the third and final section of today's talk? I'll just give you a moment. In fact, my glass of water is empty again, so I'll refill that while you think. When I return 30 seconds, if there's nothing there, we'll proceed on with the third part. Okay, I'm back. Okay, I see no questions, so let's go on to the conclusion, which is called 7 Days to Emancipation, and corresponds to also with the conclusion, the section which is marked conclusion in the Sutta. In conclusion, the Buddha explores the relationship between meditation, emancipation, and time, or samsara, and declares that if one were to practice the exercises of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta for 7 years, one will definitely attain either the state of an arhat or the state of a non-returner. Here we see very clearly that the Sutta is a kind of manual for monastics and meditators. We have discussed these states before, of course. The arhat has attained final release from the process of rebirth, that is, from time itself, and has attained the non-temporal, trans-dual, immortal, deathless state to which the Buddha frequently alludes. The Buddha himself is the highest type of arhat, thus introducing the concept of types of arhat, just as there are types of Buddhas. Not something we're not going to go into further today, but I'm sure we will on another occasion. This topic has come up from time to time in past talks also. The non-returner will never again be reborn as a human being, but is born in the 5 pure abodes, the 5 highest planes of the Rupa Loka, the middle or form realm of samsara, from which he will attain arhatship in the future after he completely purifies himself. It would, however, be a mistake to read the reference to 7 years as the time required to complete the 21 meditations of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which would work out to about 4 months per practice, although it is easy to misread the text in this way. It is rather the maximum time. For then the Buddha says that if one were to practice for 6 years, one's attainment of the state of an arhat or a non-returner is guaranteed. But then he says, wait, even 5 years is enough time to attain one of these 2 states. He continues in this vein. I say shuttling, that's not what I meant to say, reducing the required time down to 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1 year. That means that each exercise could only take 17 days. Perhaps 17 days is long enough if one were to meditate all day, but wait, the Buddha is still counting 7 months. And note here the adhesion to the symbolic number 7, whereas one might have expected him to start at 12 months. The Buddha then mentions 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 month, and then half a month. 21 practices in a month is only 1 practice a day, approximately. Maybe even that is doable by a monastic or on a retreat. But the Buddha still hasn't stopped counting. Quote, whoever should practice these 4 foundations of mindfulness for just 1 week may expect one of 2 results, either arhatship in this life, or if there should be some substrate left, the state of a non-returner, unquote. This statement parallels other suttas in which the Buddha says that 1 week or even 5 days of practice is sufficient to attain emancipation. Actually, as far as I know, the Buddha never actually says 5 days, but there are examples of the disciples of the Buddha attaining arhatship in 5 days. Kundanya comes to mind, and there are others as well. I don't believe he actually ever says 5 days, though. He says a week. Note the threefold repetition of the number 7, 7 years, 7 months, 7 days. Interestingly, the sum of 3 sevens is 21, the number of exercises described in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. The number appears in the Sutta as the number of the factors of enlightenment. In the Kabbalistic tradition, 777 is the number of salvation. The significance of the number 7 is widespread in Buddhism. For example, 7 times 7 is 49, the number of days one remains in the bardo before being reborn. That's in Tibetan Buddhism, of course. The literal meaning of this passage, then, is that by the practice of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, elaborated in the 21 practices of the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, one will achieve either emancipation or be reborn in the 5 pure abodes. The state of one will achieve either emancipation or the state of an arhat, or one will achieve the state of a non-returner and be reborn in one of the 5 pure abodes between 7 days and 7 years of practice of this sutta, depending on the amount of substrate left, quote unquote. So that word substrate is something we're going to have to examine. The first thing we would note about this passage is the minimum time in relation to the number of exercises, which casts a very different light on our first impression of the sutta. Assuming one slept 6 hours per day, in 7 days one would be able to practice 126 hours at most, allowing just 6 hours per exercise. This seems impossible. The 9 charnel ground meditations alone could not be completed in less than a year. Therefore, the 21 practices must be regarded as adjuvants or aids to the main practice, the cultivation of the 4 attentions themselves. However, underlying the cultivation of the 4 attentions is the practice of mindfulness itself. Presumably, this is the essential practice to which the Buddha refers when he says that practicing the 4 foundations of mindfulness can lead to arhatship or the state of a non-returner in as short a time as 7 days, which is implicit in all of the practices, yet identical with none of them. In other words, these exercises are just that. They are exercises that are designed to assist us to develop the actual thing that we're seeking to develop. And it is that actual thing that we're seeking to develop that is the thing that we can achieve in as short a time as 7 days. Because it would obviously be impossible to go through all of these 21 practices completely in that shorter period of time. You'll remember that in the beginning, the Buddha alludes to the one way, the Ekayano Mago, I think it was. I propose then that this phrase has a double meaning, that is, the singular or essential practice or technique that includes all other practices and techniques, and the key to the nature of this practice itself, which is oneness, self-unification, self-integration, concentration, one-pointedness, or to use the clever conceit of Evans Wentz, at-one-ment or atonement. Atonement with hyphenated becomes at-one-ment, etc. The practices of this manual of meditation combine the essential technique of attentiveness with the cultivation of wisdom, especially the realization of the nature of the body, feelings, mind, the hindrances, aggregates, senses, enlightenment, the 4 noble truths, and mindfulness itself, what I earlier called vipassana, in a progression that culminates in emancipation. The period of 1 week also seems very short until we consider 2 facts. First, the qualification that one may achieve either the state of an arhat or the state of a non-returner, thus enlarging the field significantly. And second, the reference to a substrate, which I mentioned earlier, or called attention to earlier. Now, Namoli and Bodhi's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya version of this sutta use the phrase trace of clinging instead of substrate. The Pali word is upadi. Upadi. The dictionary meaning of this word is the fuel of life. The Pali English dictionary has stuff of life, substratum of being, khandha. The khandhas are the 5 sensorial aggregates consisting of forms, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, which constitute the basis of craving. And we've discussed those earlier. The implication is that the fuel of life is exhausted by meditation on mindfulness, in which renunciation and the absence of arising of any new craving causes the existing fires of karma to quite literally burn themselves out. I'm reminded of a metaphor used by both Padmasambhav and Aleister Crowley, of the master being consumed in the intensity of his aspiration and his attainment, leaving only a residue of ash that is then blown away by the winds of prana. This implies in return that the state of mindfulness is not the same as complete emancipation, but that one who accomplishes mindfulness must attain final emancipation within 7 rebirths. Mindfulness appears as a discrete accomplishment in its own right. Otherwise, it makes no sense to refer to a period of time during which a substrate is left. Meditation burns karma, but how long it takes depends on how much karma there is. Of course, the accomplishment of mindfulness might simply be mindfulness itself, so that the reference is to the beginning of practice. In this case, 7 days is indeed a short time, but would presumably only apply to a very small group of people, what we would conventionally refer to as saints. Here we face a paradox, however, because a saint, by definition, is a person who is already well advanced in the practice of mindfulness. These are they to whom Sahampati referred when he implored the Buddha to teach for the sake of those whose eyes are covered with only a thin coating of dust. Thus, the suttas refer to a nirvana and a parinirvana, only the second of which constitutes final emancipation. In Gautama's case, the substrate contained enough karmic fuel to sustain his life for another 80 years or so. For others, this period may be extended to 7 rebirths, but no one can attain in less than 7 days, which is the period that the Buddha remained in continuous ecstasy after his enlightenment. And it is quite clear, people are surprised when I refer to nirvana as a state of ecstasy, but it is quite clear from the texts that the common conception that many people have that nirvana is a kind of blank state, a kind of zero state, a kind of non-effective state, is actually incorrect. Nirvana is an ecstatic, blissful state. The Buddha concludes, quote, "There is, monks, this one way to the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and distress, for the disappearance of pain and sadness, for the gaining of the right path, for the realization of Nibbana. That is to say, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and it is for this reason that it was said," unquote. That completes my talk for today. Thank you very much for listening. Before we proceed to the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to whatever merit may have been generated by this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask or anything they would like to discuss in relationship to the Mahasatipatthana Sutta? This is your opportunity. Please put your question here by chat. I'll give you a moment. Next week we'll be going on to the 23rd Sutta, Dialogue with a Skeptic, I think it's called, and it's also quite lengthy. Argus Portal asks, Nirvana is the result of letting go, so how could it be any state? Indeed, that is the paradox, because we think of Nirvana as a state of complete emancipation which cannot be characterized by anything whatsoever. And it certainly is not an effective state in the conventional sense, in this conventional samsaric sense of affect, which is simply identical with emotion. First thing to notice about that is that nirvana itself is actually the opposite, the corollary and opposite of samsara. So as such, samsara and nirvana still exist within the dualistic realm. So nirvana is actually, although it is outside samsara, it is not outside the realm of dualism, and then therefore it is not in itself, intrinsically, the supramundane or transcendental state. People think that commonly, but it is actually a mistake. The enlightened state, the emancipated state, the supramundane state is the transdual state, and therefore it transcends the duality of nirvana and samsara as well. So the enlightened state actually includes samsara and it includes nirvana, but is not reducible or identical with either of them. And this is found in the Pali Canon in the passages where the Buddha refers to nirvana as a door to emancipation. I guess Portal says, I thought nirvana is the result of overcoming the dualism. No, it's not. If you think about it, nirvana is the opposite of samsara. So it's still the opposite of something. So it's still dualistic. So it's still samsaric. Now, with respect to the ultimate emancipated state, from the understood in itself, as it were, the emancipated state is uncharacterizable. And that answers your question you just asked. What that means then, the emancipation. Emancipation means the liberation from samsara, the complete and final liberation and emancipation from samsara, which means the complete and final emancipation from duality and dualistic thinking and from reason and rationality itself, which are all dualistic. Nirvana is merely the negation of samsara through which we achieve the emancipated state, but which is not identical with the emancipated state itself. And when we perceive it from our perspective, our samsaric perspective, we experience nirvana as bliss. Nirvana is not the ultimate goal. That is correct. I know you've spent all this time thinking in your Buddhist practice, in your Buddhist study, you're aiming at nirvana. It's not the ultimate goal at all. And there are passages in the Pali Canon which indicate this quite plainly, and I'll point them out as we come to them. But you'll find passages in the Pali Canon which explicitly indicate that nirvana is a door, a gateway to something else. Anyway, the bliss or ecstasy of nirvana is not reducible to what we conventionally understand by bliss or ecstasy. It's a metaphor that is used to describe the experience. The experience of nirvana is mentioned throughout the Pali Canon. The Buddha's own experience of nirvana is clearly mentioned throughout the Pali Canon, and it is always identified as a blissful or ecstatic state. Now, we mustn't get confused about what we mean by a blissful or ecstatic state. We tend to think of bliss as a state of attachment to something. So this is a bliss that transcends bliss, which is the paradox that mystics of all primordial traditions use to describe their experiences. They talk about the joy that is beyond joy, the bliss that is beyond bliss, the happiness that is beyond happiness, blah, blah, blah. And so it is with nirvana. It's absolutely clear that nirvana is blissful, but we must not reduce that concept of bliss to the samsaric concept of bliss. That would be a mistake. And that's why Hinduism often you find with the cult of bhakti, which is very popular in Hinduism, and guru worship, you find people experiencing a kind of emotional drunkenness and thinking that that is enlightenment or that is emancipation. That's the result of making the mistake of conflating the bliss of attainment with the bliss of what we conventionally understand to be bliss. I hope that answered that question. That's a very interesting point, which I was quite interested to discover. It's one of my, as I read through the Pali Canon, that's one of the things I was particularly interested to discover, is A, the association of nirvana with ecstasy or bliss, and B, the realization that nirvana is still not the ultimate attainment. Any other questions before we proceed with the dedication of merit? And I will be heading over to Zhuangzhung after if anyone wants to chat. Okay, it seems like there's nothing else. So let's proceed with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit generated by this talk to all beings. Whatever understanding, whatever positive forces come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I will post the name of next week's Sutta to the Dharma transmission to the West group. And you're all welcome to head over to the Circle in Zhuangzhung at the Visit Atoll Sim if you're interested in engaging in a chat-based, spontaneous and casual chat-based Dharma discussion. Thank you very much. Namaskar.